Okay, so welcome. This talk is entitled Manilius and the Inverted World, an alternative account of the planetary joys. So thank you for coming here. I'm excited to be talking about this really important foundational topic with you all. We're going to be getting into a lot of material and a lot of philosophical discussion. So right at the outset, I want to share what the theses are I'm going to be arguing with you. What I want to argue at a general level is the simple claim that Manilius presents a clear, consistent, and powerful account of the planetary joys that's worthy of contemporary consideration. So though I use this model of the planetary joys, I'm not arguing that you have to, or that you have to abandon whatever model you're using or whatever, like the standard model. I'm just saying that this is something that is very consistent and logical and thoughtful, and it's thought-provoking, and it's worth thinking about. That's all I'm claiming, okay? And then at a more speculative level, I'm giving an interpretation of this schema and offering a historical argument that we can understand this schema as rooted in Pythagoreanism, this ancient Greek philosophical viewpoint. So those are the two main claims I'm going to be making throughout this lecture here. Okay. So if those are the theses, what's the actual ground plan? What's the agenda we're going to be doing as we walk through this talk? So the first section will be preliminary items. I'm hoping to clear the ground of certain prejudices and presuppositions that might stand in the way of understanding Manilius. So I want to preempt certain kinds of objections people might make by clearing the conceptual ground in this first section. So I'll talk about what the places are in astrology, what the planetary joys are, and this concept of traditions versus tradition in Hellenistic astrology. What are these things? And then after the ground is cleared, we'll take a close reading of Manilius's account of the planetary joy schema and examine its inner logic. And then once we understand what that view is, we'll take a step back and have some historical hypotheses about how this schema can be interpreted in a philosophical viewpoint. Okay, so let's begin with the preliminaries. So the first thing we need to understand is to have a clear view of what the places are in astrology. And this can be confusing because of the vagaries of translation, right? So what we in kind of Western English-speaking astrology call a sign is translated in the Greek by the word oikos. And oikos means house. So the literal translation of a sign is a house or an oikos, right? So you see on this picture here, there's a nice quaint house. It's where someone lives. It's a place wherein one dwells. It's a dwelling place of something. On the other hand, the things we call houses in English-speaking astrology are translations of the word topos, which is literally a place. We might think of a topic or a location. And you see here this picture of a kind of general map or a certain kind of coordinate system, right? You think of topology and mathematics. It's a general place, right? But this place has been translated by house, even though literally it means place. So this is the first fundamental confusion and thing to keep in mind. The things we're translating as signs literally mean house. And the things we're translating as houses literally mean places. Okay, what are these houses and places then? Right, so here's the first confusion. I'm going to move my Zoom screen because I'm not able to see my slides. Okay, so there's a common assertion that the places are concrete. All right, so I hear this a lot in the teaching of Hellenistic astrology. Somehow that the places are the points where the powers of abstract, the abstract heavens are anchored down to earth. This is where we live. It's these concrete, the concrete places in astrology. So in fact, in Demetri George's new book, she entitles her first chapter, right, when she's talking about the houses, Down to Earth, right? Down to Earth. It's these, the houses are what bring these abstract concepts down to daily life. So for example, I mean, she says this explicitly. And again, this is a very standard kind of view in contemporary Hellenistic astrology. The houses represent the places on Earth where the energies of the cosmos are anchored to the physical world of everyday life, right? So anchoring to the physical, the concrete. As terrestrial locations, locations on Earth, they specify the various places where humans engage in activities of the human condition, right? So again, it's our concrete human activities that are signified by these houses on the standard view. And explicitly, in the trinity of signs, planets, and houses, the houses represent the most concrete topics of the astrological system. So of all the reference of astrology, the house topics are said to be the most concrete ones. Mm-hmm. And the argument I'm hoping to forestall is, well, the account Manilius gives of the places, it has some kind of abstract component, so thus it surely couldn't be the Hellenistic view, because the Hellenistic view is anchored in the earth and it's the most concrete kinds of things. And I want to forestall this because though this view is widely accepted and it's spoken of as if it's like a fact or a doctrine about Hellenistic astrology, it doesn't strike me as obvious, right? I don't see where it's coming from. So the first thing I want to consider is, if we think of signs and planets, these can refer to concreta. So when I talk about concreta and abstracta, I'm talking about concrete objects or particulars versus abstract objects or general things. And we can think of this distinction through like predication, right? So I could say, is furry, this kind of predicate, right? That's something that's abstract. It can refer to your kitten. It can refer to a dog. It can refer to a hamster, right? Or a mouse. All of these particular concrete pets or entities all exemplify the common feature, furriness, right? So this furriness, or the predicate is furry, is going to be something that's abstract. It's an abstract thing that can be hold of many individual things. Whereas, say, Fido the dog, it's just Fido the dog. It's a particular concrete object in space and time, right? I'm not going to say something Fido's. I'm not going to predicate that of something. It's a singular object. So I'm wanting to say is that when we look at the reference of signs and planets, these can refer to concreta, not just abstracta, right? We're not just talking about general things that can be predicated, but to very concrete objects, right? So, for example, think of the standard correspondences between the parts of the body and the signs, right? So here we have the signs. It can refer to your head, right? Your head is a very concrete thing. Your neck is a very concrete thing. In each of these cases, we can go through all the signs. Each of your body parts is a concrete object. We're not talking about abstractions like the headness, like in the way that like the gods are the head of the universe or something like that. We're talking about a very concrete reality, and we're referring to that through the signs. Secondly, again, in the text, and a part of the text that is often ignored, the signs can refer to concrete locations or countries. So Aries could refer to Persia, a domain, a specific place. Taurus to Cappadocia, right? Again, this is rooted in the ancient text and is referring to a particular, a concrete object. And the same can be said of planets. So the sun, it can refer to your father, right? The specific person. The master, right? In that time, a specific person. Your right eye, again, something very concrete. It's this one rather than that one. The heart, your heart. Gold, a physical object. Wheat and barley, again, physical things you can eat. The moon, body, mother, again, left eye, stomach, marrow, silver and glass. All of these are very concrete realities of human life, and all of these are referred to by the signs and planets. These are things they signify in the texts we're citing as constitutive of this so-called Hellenistic tradition. Okay, so it's not that the signs and planets can't refer to concreta. Furthermore, when we look at the places and the way these places, the meanings of the places and the reference of the places are construed in this so-called Hellenistic tradition, they can refer to abstracta, things that are multiply exemplifiable, things that are more general, that it's not just a particular object, right? So for example, valence, who's taken as, again, very normative in this modern interpretation of Hellenistic astrology, says that the first place can refer to life, right? And notice that life is something that's general. I'm alive, your pets are alive, right? It can refer to giving and receiving. Again, this is something that's general. You can give your child instruction. You can give your friend a coffee. You can give your students instruction. All of these things, all of these particular instances, these concrete acts are subsumed under giving and receiving, this general kind of thing. Again, association. We might be associating right now in this particular meeting. You might have different kinds of associations. Maybe you go out to a political affiliation or a religious affiliation and so forth. All of these are going to be different congregations of people, but they all exemplify this general feature of association. And again, through the rest of these, authority, there are different kinds of authority, rents and revenue, rank, activity, alterations, something that's very general. Dangers, what kind of dangers? It doesn't say. They're general dangers. It can be a danger of getting eaten by a lion, the danger of being killed by a soldier. Religious matters, association, again, the completion of some good deed or benefaction, hostility, success, law in general, mystic and occult matters, associations again. So notice even the kind of strangeness in here that you've got like multiple meanings for the different places, right? So there's so many instances of association here for the different places. Success, change, hopes, hostility again, dangers, right? So all of these significations for the places, they are abstract. So I really don't see why this assertion is being made that somehow the places are the things that refer to the concrete realities of human life, right? Signs and planets can refer to abstract things. Places can also can refer to concrete things, and places can refer to abstract things. Okay, furthermore, and this is just my intuition, this standard position that the signs refer to abstracta and the houses refer to concreta, that this reverses the common sense order of abstraction between the oikos and the topos, right? So if I think of my house, right, or you think of your house or your apartment, does that strike you as something that's more or less concrete as a spatiotemporal, like physical thing, than a coordinate, a general location, right? If I was going to give you like a latitude and longitude coordinate, which one is more abstract and which one is more concrete? For me, what seems to me to be the obvious point of view is that the house is more concrete. It's where I dwell. It's where I live, right? So that also is a weird thing. So then, you know, to illustrate this, that I'm not the only person that has this intuition, Heidegger seems to think so as well. So if you look at this picture here, you see this quaint old village, this beautiful bridge. You see the sky with storm on the one hand and light coming through, right? And Heidegger would say that this bridge here, this concrete thing, right? What it is essentially is a gathering of what he called the earth, sky, divinity, and mortals, right? So earth and sky are pretty obvious in this picture, right? We can see the earth underneath it, and it's holding up this bridge in a particular way. The sky is shining down in a particular way. We can see the seasons and the weather on it. The bridge is made by humans in their comings and goings and their everyday concerns. And the divinities we might think of as present in the river itself. The people might think of it as this river as this kind of god that must be crossed, or the god that guards and separates the near and the far. And maybe there's some kind of saint guarding the bridge, right? Some kind of higher meaning that unifies all these things. So in this way, he thought, was a thing, this very concrete unity of the fourfold in this way, having to do with our human life. Something is on the near end of the bridge and something is on the far end. And by near, it's something that I can grasp, something that's near me, to my subjective point of view right now, embodied. And the far end is something that's far from me, from my subjective point of view, from my powers. So then Heidegger describes this as a locale. The bridge is a locale. As such a thing, it allows a space into which earth and sky and divinities and mortals are admitted. This space allowed by the bridge contains many places, variously near or far from the bridge, right? So again, like the bridge is there, and if I'm on the bridge, I'm either at the far end or I can go to the far end and I'm at the near end. It's grounded in my concrete perspective. These places, however, may be thought of as mere positions between which there lies a measurable distance. A distance, in Greek, stadion, always has a room for it, and indeed by bare positions, right? So we can think of space in a different way. The first, more concrete way is this fourfold gathering that's rooted in our concrete perspective. This other way is that we abstract from that and think of it as a kind of general layout where anything could occupy. The space that is thus made by positions is space of a particular sort. Thus, nearness and remoteness between men and things can become a mere distance, mere intervals of intervening space. In a space that is presented purely as spatium, the bridge now appears as a mere something at some position, which can be occupied at any time by something else or replaced by a mere marker. So here we have an abstracted view of space, right? We can see this space not as the space of this particular bridge and a bridge that's opening up particular concerns for me, but just as a general place in the coordinate system, whereas I could like plop in any concrete object, right? Anything could just as well go there. So here we have, again, this idea that there are different ways of conceptualizing space, and one of them seems much more concrete in the kind of way that like this bridge would be or a house would be, that seems more concrete, and then this other more abstracted way where it's just a location or a topos, right? So it seems that that this concept of a topos or a general location is the more general of the concepts here. Okay, upshot of that then is that this presupposition or prejudice that we need to consider the places to be concrete isn't necessarily true, right? We don't have to accept it. We need not consider the places to be any more concrete than the other components of our astrological system. And then the question occurs to me, like, why this confusion? And I don't have an answer here. I mean, maybe you can offer something in the Q&A. But my thought is that maybe it's a carryover from the general English terms of sign and house. So in English, sign sounds more abstract, right? It's a general sign for something. Signs signify. It's a general kind of thing. A stop sign might signify stopping, and that sign can like hold at many different locations. There's a common meaning. Whereas house, again, seems concrete. So maybe it's just a kind of confusion coming from the English translation. Or maybe there's an importation of the singular reference of the ascendant into all four cardinal points, or to all four cardinal points into the house system as a whole. Because there is something concrete about the ascendant, right? When we say, this is what was rising at this particular time. It's this birth chart, this moment of time, something that's captured right now, right? That's going to freeze a particular moment. And there's something concrete about that. Or if we wanted to do it via a definite description, we could just like specify the time and location, right? Just like we do when we type it into our software. That's picking a particular moment of time. So these things do seem like they're, in some sense, trying to grasp a particular moment, or maybe through that, a particular person, like your natal chart, or that event, right? This particular thing. So that seems like it's got this kind of anchoring into a kind of like concrete reference. So maybe people are taking that and then just importing it into all the significations of the signs, rather than just the cardinal points and a particular function of one of the cardinal points. So those are just hypotheses. So here then is the standard view, probably something that you are familiar with. So at the helm is Mercury. Mercury rejoices at the helm, or the first place. Over the horizon is the realm of the daimon. So in the world of the sunlight, in the daylight, is the realm of the daimon on high. And we start with the bad daimon in the first place. Saturn goes there. Then the good daimon, Jupiter, goes there in the 11th. 10th house is empty. The sun rejoices in the 9th, in the place of God. 8th house is empty. 7th house is empty. And then we hit the realm of fortune, that's under the earth, right? So we have bad fortune. That is assigned to Mars in the 6th place. Good fortune is assigned to Venus in the 5th place. The 4th place is likewise empty. And the moon rules the 3rd, the place of the goddess, and the 2nd place is empty. So this is the standard view. If you're taught the planetary joys in some kind of Hellenistic training program, this is going to be the thing that's taught, right? And a lot of the texts do articulate this kind of a vision, right? But then notice, we have this ancient text, this Astronomica by Marcus Manilius, that constitutes one of our oldest and most detailed accounts of the places, right? So, well, a lot of these texts will just be like, this rejoices here, this rejoices there. This one seems to give some arguments for why they rejoice in the place they rejoice at, and elaborates it in more detail. I noticed that this text was written around 14 AD. So given what we have, this is a very early Hellenistic text. It's about 150 years before Valen's anthologies, and about 600 to 700 years before Rhetorius's compendium, right? So just on the face of it, you're looking at this and you're like, wow, this is something to read. This is interesting, right? This should be a key prime source of information, something a Hellenistic philosopher or astrologer would want to think about. And then even more interestingly, it gives us a different account of the planetary joys, right? It's not going to be the standard view. It's something different. It's something new. And it's something that's thoughtful and detailed. So this should be, when astrologers see this, they should be like, oh, wow, I'm really excited. I'd like to learn, right? There's something to think about here. And what does it look like, in brief? Well, if you notice, this is a very different kind of schema. Here's Manilius's view. Manilius says that Mercury is at the helm, right? So that's constant. The place of God is in the 9th place. That's a constant. Place of the goddess is in the 3rd. That's a constant. Happy fortune. Jupiter's in the 11th. That's there, but it's got a different name. And in fact, if you look at the hemispheres, there's a very big difference, right? Notice that fortune's on the top now, and that the realm of the daimon's on the bottom. So it's a complete reversal, right? You've reversed the hemispheres. That's interesting. Notice further, the 6th and the 12th, we don't have our malefics there. They're empty, right? Another big difference. Saturn is not in the 12th. Mars is not in the 6th. Furthermore, speaking of empty places, a lot of those places that were empty now have something in it, and they're not the standard planets, right? We've got gods assigned to these things that aren't planetary entities. So Manilius assigns Typhon rising. So there's this kind of monster that's created by Earth in order to fight for the Titans. Typhon rising in the 2nd place and falling in the 8th. And then Pluto, Lord of the Underworld, ruling the 7th. It's a big difference, right? And notice that the 10th place now has something there. Venus is rejoicing in the 10th. The 4th place now has something there. Saturn is rejoicing in the 4th. And the 5th place instead of being the place where Venus rejoices, is the place where Mars rejoices, right? So it's this very, very different scheme. It should be very interesting. So we're going to have a view that's detailed, that's elaborate, is ancient, and gives this very, very different picture. So again, the attitude I would expect would be that people who are interested in Hellenistic astrology would be really excited about this. They think like, oh, I want to learn what this is about. What is going on here? Yeah, the fact that Manilius attests to a different conceptualization of the joys should be exciting to those interested in the theory and practice of ancient astrology. So for an example, consider the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in the 20th century for historians of religion. So in the 20th century, basically like people stumbled across a cave with a bunch of like ancient texts. And they found out that they had a bunch of Gnostic gospels that people had presumed we didn't have any access to, right? That they had been destroyed. We've got this set of texts that talk about a very different version of early Christianity than what we knew, right? So we'll have, Jesus talking like some kind of like Greek Platonist philosopher, right? A very different perspective. And it's also got Hermetic texts in there. So we get an exciting window into the religious practice of the time and what early Christianity looked like at the time as it was rising, right? And historians were lightly excited about this. This was something we did not know, and then we could discover it and we could learn. We would expect this from Hellenistic astrologers, but there's a really surprising reception where this is not what we get. Instead, what happens is Manilius's account is either ignored or disdained. Right? It's something that people don't want to look at. They don't think it's worth the time or don't want to devote intellectual effort to. So, for example, Schmidt, in one of his famous essays, Facets of Fate, talks about Manilius's characterization of the houses and says it's so sketchy and so aberrant that one can have little confidence in them. So right off the bat, Schmidt is a formative influence here in this kind of reconstruction of the Hellenistic tradition. So at the outset, he's got this kind of negative evaluation of it. And then this is continued all the way to the present day in the book that's basically just released this year. George, in her annotated bibliography of Hellenistic astrologers, she talks about Manilius. And her account of Manilius is, Manilius was a Roman author of an instructional poem in Latin written in 5 books, which is the first surviving complete major work on Hellenistic astrology. Again, should be important, right? However, it's considered somewhat idiosyncratic and inconsistent in comparison to the doctrines established by the ancient tradition as a whole, right? So it's this idea of like, yeah, but it's weird, right? It's weird. It doesn't warrant attention, right? It's not in keeping with the doctrines given by this tradition as a whole. And this continues in a kind of ambiguous treatment given in George's account. Again, because this is a major work right now talking about the houses. It's kind of representative of where Hellenistic astrology is as a kind of standard view. Notice Manilius, when you go through that book, Manilius is in the chapter headings. So it's clear he's doing something. Like he's like at the top, right? At the very top. It's in the chapter headings. It's because he's like saying really beautiful and exciting and detailed things. But then whenever his account conflicts with the standard model, it's only noted to be dropped, right? It's just like, different, but gone. So when we talk about Saturn rejoicing in the 4th, of all the Hellenistic authors, only Manilius claimed that Saturn rejoices in this place. The others did not have any planet rejoicing in the 4th. And then that's it. There's no further discussion of why he might have done this or why that might be important and why his view is worth considering. Or again, when we get to Venus rejoicing in the 10th, in this idiosyncratic passage, again, like, oh, it's unique and that's like bad, not unique, like it gives us a window and is a kind of rich source of reflection. In this idiosyncratic passage, Manilius gave the 10th house as the rejoicing place of Venus, the only Hellenistic astrologer to do so. And then again, dropped, not talking about what his justification is or why it might be worth considering, even if you don't want to use it, right? But worth considering. And again, compare this to the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library. And sadly, the response sounds like someone in some fundamentalist sect, right, to learning about the discovery of the Gnostic Gospels, right? So if someone is like in a very like closed sect of Christianity that is very wedded to a particular version of the Bible or a particular version of their faith, and then they see something in the past that differs from it, what's the judgment going to be? These books are idiosyncratic, right? They conflict with the canonical texts and have not been used in my congregation or have no bearing on its dogma, right? So ignore it, right? Because it deviates from the tradition. And thus you don't need to think about it, right? I mean, that's the main thing I want to get at. Like, you don't need to think about it. No one's saying you have to embrace it, right? Just saying you should think about it. And then the response here, as you would respond to someone who's in a very closed down kind of sect, you would say like, yes, but precisely it's because of this conflict and so-called idiosyncrasy that makes it an interesting object of study, right? Yes, it conflicts with what your congregation says, right? But I'm interested in what does conflict with what your congregation says, right? I'm interested in the broader historical origins of things and their philosophical point of view, not just one. Okay, and then a further strange attitude in the so-called astrological community is this way that so-called idiosyncrasy is dealt with, right? So if it exists only in Manilius, it's like, oh, alternative joys, it deviates from the tradition. It's the only source, it's idiosyncratic, ignore it. But then something like zodiacal releasing, when you've got the full like articulation of it only in Valens, then it's like, thank the astrological gods that this text has been preserved because it is the only source for this powerful Time Lord technique that will shake your very philosophical view of reality and make you stop believing in free will, right? So it's this very inconsistent view of how to deal with novelty in the tradition, right? In the so-called tradition, which is very strange. So then this brings us to the final preliminary, the Hellenistic tradition. So you see the Grand Astro Inquisitor up at the top of this picture here. And it tends to be like, tends to be this idea of like a hypostasizing of astrological theory and claiming that it has a kind of dogmatic status, almost like a doctrine of a church would be, or a doctrine of a religion. That's very troubling, I should say. So note the almost religious conception of tradition that's employed by contemporary Hellenistic astrologers. So again, consider this quote from George when she's talking about Manilius and claiming that his doctrines are idiosyncratic and unique in comparison to the doctrines established by the ancient tradition as a whole, right? So there is this ancient tradition that's unified, it's monolithic, it's coherent, and it has the authority to establish doctrines, right? They are authoritative and they articulate along these particular lines, okay? And then even earlier, we can see Schmidt making a similar claim in, again, this essay, Facets of Fate. He claims, what follows are some of the newest findings of Project Hindsight research. I will be concentrating on Hellenistic astrology, which was the type of astrology practiced in the Mediterranean area and the Near East from the 2nd century BCE up until the 6th century CE. So notice here, he's giving this initial definition of what Hellenistic astrology is, and he's doing it simply by talking about a certain geographical space and a certain temporal time span. All right, so it's going to be the type of astrology that people were practicing in a particular place at a particular time. So on this definition, it's just going to pick out whatever people were doing, and this is consistent with a diversity of practices, right? There could be all kinds of views going on in this vast swath of the earth and in this large time span. So here, this is perfectly consistent with there being a massive kind of diversity of practice. But then note what he goes on to say. And he gives this a stronger, heavier account of tradition. This type of astrology is, in fact, the true source of all later Western astrology, right? So now we've got the true fount of knowledge, the ultimate authority that's generating the rest of the Western astrological tradition. Although it will be part of my concern to point out the ways in which the medieval tradition began to deviate from this starting point due to errors in transmission and interpretation. So again, true source now, this coherent set of doctrines, and in such a way that anything that deviates from it will be a deviation from it, right? If it differs, it's a deviation, and it's something that's having to do with error. You did not understand the doctrine correctly. It was not given to you correctly, or you failed to interpret it. So now we've got the Hellenistic tradition as articulating a monolithic kind of doctrine, against which all other doctrines should be measured somehow. Again, a very strong, heavy, religious kind of view of astrology. So note again the view. It's claimed that the Hellenistic tradition is a tradition that authoritatively establishes a coherent set of doctrines, right? Just like the Catholic tradition or the Orthodox tradition, or we could say a biblical tradition in Christianity, right? There's a religion to be practiced, and there's a set of dogmas that are there, and these dogmas are said to be established somehow authoritatively, and then a certain institution or people or set of texts have the authority to establish that. It is the true source of all later Western astrology, so everything else somehow comes from it. It's the generative source. There couldn't be new insights, right? There couldn't be multiple sources. No, there's one true source. They have the true way. And note how Schmidt tacitly moves from a temporal and geographical definition of the Hellenistic tradition, which seems reasonable, to this much heavier and much more normative one. And notice that, you know, the first seems obvious, like, yeah, talk about like whatever's going on in a certain time, like space and time. Fine, that's easy. We can all agree to that. This other one, that there is a normative tradition that's unified and has a coherent set of doctrines, that needs proof, right? It would seem to me the burden of proof is on these people claiming that such a normative doctrine exists to show us from those texts, right? Show us univocally from those texts how there is just this one point of view, right? And honestly, I have not seen that yet. And I haven't even seen much of an attempt of that. I've just seen dogmatic proclamations that such a thing is so. Also note, they're claiming anything that differs from these doctrines, which they have decided are doctrines, is a deviation from true astrology or true Western astrology. And this could only be due to errors in transmission or interpretation, right? The possibility that some new insight can be gained or new viewpoint formulated, or even an older viewpoint recovered. That's not a possibility. Or that there's diversity all the way through. These aren't considered, right? It's just stipulated. No, these are errors in transmission or interpretation because there has to be just this one source, this one doctrinal authoritative source that everything's coming from. So again, it would be interesting if that was true, right? I just want to see a very clear argument for that. I'm not going to take this on faith, right? So, and I don't think you should do this either. Yeah, so this doctrine of, like, if we think of it like this heavy Hellenistic tradition, like if we're thinking of it like, yeah, God handed it down to Nicepto and Petasiris, right? And there's this unbroken chain of apostolic succession. When we look at the text, there's actually like little there to support this. So even Valens, who's set up as a hero amongst these ones who are like holding to the tradition, he's like seen as the canon, basically. Look at how he talks about the state of astrology at his time. I've written for those who wish to learn every systematic procedure of the other astrological compilers. Each of the other astrological compilers has worked out his own complex procedures, but has not published his solutions, since each is secretive and begrudging and neglected his readers. I, however, have investigated with much toil and long experience and have published my system. This seems to be my greatest achievement, to explicate the ideas of others which have been buried in mystery. I myself could have compiled my many procedures using a fog of words, but I did not want to show myself to be like those babblers. So what he's noting here is that, like, there are a bunch of other astrologers at the time. They have different systems. he thinks those complex procedures make no sense, and he's using his critical judgment on them to be like, yeah, those babblers, right? They're babblers. I'm right. I'm going to give you a clearer kind of account of it. That's my own personal view, right? Not that the one that's really in keeping with the secret tradition, but one that seems right? That's clearer, that's rationally articulable. Therefore, if I find you speaking, if you find me speaking very often about my generosity and how great I am, and openness, please forgive my words. I have suffered much. I have endured toil. I was cheated by many men, and I spent money that seemed to me to be inexhaustible because I was persuaded by mountebanks and greedy men. Nevertheless, because of my endurance and my love for systematic knowledge, I outlasted them all. If my readers recognize the accuracy of these systems, they will give us praise with delight, right? So he's wanting praise personally for his work. Again, not in keeping with the tradition I have received from Nicepso, I have preserved for you, right? Very different kind of attitude. Praise me because I've thought it through and I'm giving you a clear account of it that's differing from everybody else who's a babbler. Others, because of their stupidity, will envy and malign us, and they may be exalted by the illumination of mystical or secret things, and they will steal some procedures from my compilation. So notice the people that disagree with him, that possibly are coming from like a mystery tradition, that are wanting to keep things veiled, that are operating with this like more of a traditional kind of view of like, it was handed by King Meteshapsko and we're carrying on this tradition. He's like, yeah, they're just like, they're stupid, right? They're full of envy and maligning me. So on such men, I place dire curses, which is weird, and I think they will suffer. Let the readers of our collected works which explicate all procedures, not say, so do not say this procedure is from the king, and this is from Pedicirus, and this is from Critidemus, etc., which is what you would do in a kind of traditional view, right? You would articulate your view in view of the tradition and put it in the mouth of your master or the original source of it. He's saying, do not do that. If you take my stuff and say it was from Nicepso and Pedicirus, I'm going to curse you because I have put a lot of work into this. And I want this to be systematic and it's mine. Instead, let them know that these men propounded their art in an obtuse and recondite fashion and thereby showed that their science lacked a true foundation. There, it seems like he's criticizing these other traditions. We, on the other hand, supplied solutions and not only revived this dying art. Notice what he's saying about the astrology of his time. There's a lot of it, and he's calling it dying, right? He's saying he's going to revive it, but also banked glory for ourselves and initiated other worthy men, attracting them not with the lure of money, but by recognizing them to be scholars and enthusiasts. We, too, have been controlled by this kind of fate, right? So in Valens, we see he's not operating from some kind of conception of a univocal or authoritative tradition. So again, compare this to St. Paul, right? St. Paul, he's going to come down and be like, we command you, brethren, withdraw yourselves from every brother that walketh disorderly and not after the tradition he received from us, right? So there is an authoritative tradition from heaven. It's binding, and anyone who disagrees with that, you stay away from them. Instead, Valens is saying there's a bunch of complex procedures that are competing with his own, and he thinks most of them are bad. He's using his critical reasoning and saying they don't live up to his ideals of clarity and systematicity. And he even went so far as to place curses on those who would subsume his work under a broader tradition without giving him personal credit for it. And if you think of pseudepigraphal writings, again, so writings that would be like, you think of like the Gnostic Gospels, and they're like, this is the Gospel of St. Peter, right? Or this is a letter of St. Peter, or the Apocalypse of Peter, right? These are individual writers, and they're giving, they're putting their words in the mouth of the master, right? They're doing that in order to get more authority for themselves, but also in the thought that like, I am not important. If what I say is true, doesn't matter who says it, right? I'm speaking for the tradition. And this is not what Valens is doing here. He's speaking up as an individual, right? So we don't see this kind of concept of an authoritative tradition in this sense by Valens, if we want to use him. And so we can also consider another example from Valens, right? So here's another passage from Valens. Valens sends his greetings to Marcus. The information set out by the divine king Nicepso in the beginning of his 13th book has been exhaustively treated in our previous compilations and in the labors of others. So he's talking about this very old astrological text or tradition attributed to divine King Nechepso, right? So some very early strata of this so-called tradition. Now, I will compile the following material, falling short in no respect. So he's claiming that his material is going to be just as good as his previous material. It is obvious that the king made his explanations with mystic intelligence, and that he has also been the guide, even for us, in our approach to this art. Okay, so a nod to this early King Nechepso. His willingness to confess and then correct his early errors is a sign of nobility and wisdom on his part, which gave him the intelligence to know when to change his mind. So look what he's attributing to Nechepso here. He's claiming that this earliest kind of astrology, this earliest astrological text or tradition, it's something that's inconsistent, right? Nechepso changed his mind. Now this could be that an author was really like one Nechepso writing this text and changed his view from one part to another and confessed that. Or maybe there were multiple texts being attributed to Nechepso and they contradicted each other, right? Both of these are compatible with what he's claiming here. But notice he's not saying divine King Nechepso who gave the original doctrine which was coherent and authoritative in this way. He was saying, no, this text here contained errors, and the later texts confessed those errors and changed their minds, right? The fact that he despised his kingship and power and devoted himself to these matters is a sign of his experience and persuasiveness, qualities which reveal this art's alluring and attractive face to his successors. No necessity for making a living and no trickery caused by greed affected him, as these traits have affected so many nowadays. So he's noting that the people practicing astrology in his day seemed to be motivated by greed and making some money, and that maybe some kinds of trickery was involved in his day. As a result, this man must be taken as a model. Okay, good. He goes on, talking about further writers in this astrological tradition. The very wise Critidemus, in the vital work attributed to him, the Horasis, made such a beginning of great mystery, to wit, already having traversed the seas and having crossed great deserts, I was thought worthy by the gods to reach a safe harbor and a secure resting place. Timaeus, Asclepius, and many others have said the same. These men were carried away by the beauty of words and by reports of marvels, and they did not produce works which fulfilled their promise, nor were these works complete and lucid, but rather they left their readers in the lurch many times, and at all times were warped, begrudging, withdrawn, and deceptive. So notice how he's treating these other early astrological writers, Critidemus, Timaeus, Asclepius. He's saying, yeah, they were doing some good things, maybe there were beautiful words, but they were not complete and lucid, and they didn't fulfill their promise, and these doctrines these texts were warped and begrudging and withdrawn, so something esoteric about them. And Valens's evaluation of this is that this is deceptive, right? These are deceptive. He's rejecting them in these ways. They never traveled one road, right? So one coherent dogma or set of doctrines. This is not the tradition he's talking about, right? He's pointing to these early traditional texts and saying, like, there was not one road, right? But they piled scheme on scheme and wrote books which could be prosecuted because they are proofs of fraud, not of truth. So he's claiming there's diversity in these early texts, and they contradict each other. And he's claiming that all these early texts, what they're amounting to, are things that could be prosecuted. Should be like brought up on charges for, because they're fraudulent. They are not true. This Critidemus, although he had inherited a mass of theorems, had developed others himself and was able to interpret clearly, still obscured the truth because of the appearance of his tables. So he's obscuring things. Again, we don't get this kind of reverential treatment of a tradition here that's monolithic. Instead, we see the very opposite in the way that Valens is talking about this tradition. And again, Valens contrasts himself with all the astrologers who came previously, right? I, on the other hand, in my previously compiled books, have composed an oeuvre which does not consist of vain and empty babble. Everything else previously, vain and empty babble. Nor have I included the questionable solutions using someone's mere opinion. Right, so all that stuff written before, that's mere opinion. Or purely qualitative, non-numerical writings. Right? He's saying he's doing something different. And he's judging all those earlier texts as being defective, right? Approaching what seemed to be the truth, he, Critidemus, wandered off into endless inquiry and criticism. One who wishes to write treatises must proceed as if wishing nothing else. If he does, he will import error into his work because of his ignorance and spite. So again, his analysis of astrologers working at his time and earlier, the earlier texts, he's saying are full of ignorance and spite. They're somehow malicious. Therefore, having traversed the sea and having crossed many lands, I have surveyed many climes and nations, have been plunged in long toil and trouble, finally to be thought worthy by God of attaining secure foreknowledge and a safe harbor. So again, note what he articulated in this passage. Nicepso is praised for having changed his mind, right? This earliest text, or a tradition of texts, isn't consistent, according to Valens, right? We have testimony that it was inconsistent. At some point, Nicepso changed his mind. Furthermore, later texts like Critidemus, Timaeus, and Asclepion are criticized for being incomplete, obscure, and deceptive, right? They possibly are coming from some kind of mystery religion, or a mystery esoteric tradition, and because of that, they're obscure, they're not written for the outsiders, and Valens' judgment of that is that it's deceptive, right? These texts never traveled one road. They didn't give that monolithic doctrine or system, but they piled scheme on scheme, diversity, contradiction, and wrote books which could be prosecuted because they are proofs of fraud, not truth. He thinks they're in error, they're all in error. Valens claims that he alone presents work that does not consist of vain and empty babble. So his analysis of the tradition at his time is that it's vain and empty babble, right? He's going to give you something sure. Others operate from ignorance and spite, right? So not only are they wrong, but they're all spiteful, they're terrible, unlike him. So yeah, this is a textual window into the state of play in early astrology, right? And we don't see that kind of reverential picture of the Hellenistic tradition that seems to be generated by contemporary Hellenistic astrologers. I'm just not seeing it in the text here. It looks like it's much more diverse and contentious, right? It's contentious. And Porphyry claims in his letter to Anebo, the canons also of genethliology, so the prediction of the natal day, are innumerable and incomprehensible. So there are lots of ways of doing this procedure, right? There's innumerable of them, and they don't make any sense, right? It's hard to understand them. They conflict with each other. And the knowledge of this mathematical science cannot be obtained. Right? He's claiming that what's going on here cannot constitute knowledge because of this, these innumerable kinds of techniques and the fact that they seem to be incomprehensible, right? They contradict each other. For there is much dissonance concerning it. Again, contradiction. They're not saying the same thing. And Chaeremon and many others have written against it. So not only do we have the standard astrological text, but we've also got other astrological interpreters coming in and criticizing it, right? They're criticizing it and pointing out all the dissonance going on in the practice at the time, right? And earlier. So again, we have testimony that the doctrines of early astrology were diverse and contradictory. We did not have a monolithic tradition, at least as indicated by these texts, right? The doctrines were criticized by many as being incoherent and thus unable to provide knowledge, right? So, this textual evidence we're working with, I'm just not seeing the assertion that we have a kind of like astrological tradition, like we would have a Catholic tradition or an Orthodox tradition, that there were somehow like astrological councils that came together and solidified a doctrine to like throw out the heretics and make something coherent. No, we're seeing incoherence, right? We're seeing diversity and contradiction from the start, right? There are a lot of people practicing lots of different things at the time. Okay, right. So notice that there are different ways of thinking of tradition, right? There's this like way of like, it's this dogma, it's this dogma that must be passed down and it's unchanging, versus I was taught something and I thought about it and I manipulated it, and then somebody else will manipulate that as well. And there's this critical reflection, right? So there's equivocation going on. And I call this the shell game of tradition. So if you go to like a famous city, like some big city, there's usually people on the street corner trying to cheat the tourists by saying, like, have a bunch of like cups and say like, can you guess where the shell is under the cup? And usually they've got some kind of trick, and then they switched it. So I want to say that this is going on when people talk about the Hellenistic tradition. There's an equivocation between a kind of abstract unity. So like when they talk about tradition in a reasonable way, it's like, well, there's a Hellenistic tradition because they used planets, and then modern planets weren't there yet. So it's the 7 traditional planets, and they use signs and they use places. And yeah, that seems different. Other kinds of astrologies didn't use all those things in the same way. So like, yeah, there's a general unity here. And then we can like nod our heads and be like, yeah, that makes sense. There's a Hellenistic tradition. It's not like you're just using the decans, right? We've got these other elements. And like, yeah, that's new. That's worthwhile. But then quickly, in other contexts, it switches to the sense of tradition as in a particular dogma, right? That this is a set kind of way. So you're going to get something like, well, yes, what's the tradition? The joys must be this way, all right? Manilius is outside the tradition. Or the places are concrete, right? They cannot refer to abstracta because it's part of the beauty of the Hellenistic tradition. Or again, like signs have no significations, even though if you look at the earliest conception, like the delineations of signs, there are significations there. There are significations in the early texts. The sun cannot signify personality. It's outside the Hellenistic tradition. That's modern astrology. And then you read a passage from Porphyry where it looks like he's talking about personal characteristics as signified by the sun. Or again, like Mars cannot signify sexuality. That's Venus. This is the Mars and sexuality. That's a modern thing. It's deviating from the Hellenistic tradition. And again, you read like, I think it's like Teacher Babylon. It's like giving sexual significations for Mars. So you're giving these very concrete particular dogmas and saying that the tradition speaks for it. That it's this really clear, articulate, authoritative thing, like a church dogma, right? And there's a back and forth between these. And I think that's really not helpful and adds to the confusion. So my thought, even though I know it won't be upheld, and I'm not asking that like we cancel the term tradition. And I know I haven't kept it this request myself, and I probably won't in the future. But just to think about, like, maybe putting a moratorium on the term, like when we're tempted to use the term Hellenistic astrology or the Hellenistic tradition, right? Just ask yourself, does this add clarity and sophistication to my astrological practice or the dialogue before me, right? Is this thing helping me think more clearly and do better astrology? Or am I using it like a thought terminating cliche, right? Am I using it in the same way some kind of fundamentalist would say, such and so is unbiblical, right? You can talk, I'm not meaning to like pick on fundamentalists. You can have very productive intellectual conversations with fundamentalists about the Bible, right? But what you want to do is you want to talk about what the text is, what it's saying, and why they think it's true. And then we can have an argument about like why I might not think it's true, right? And then in that meeting point, we can have an intellectual exchange. But if something is just at the level of like, it violates the tradition or it's not biblical, right? The conversation is over and we're not thinking anymore. It's closing down conversation and it's closing down thought. And if we are using it in that way, I think, and my sense is it's usually used this way. I think we should just stop using it. It's not helpful, right? What should we do instead? Why not just talk about particular authors and passages you find insightful, right? So instead of the Hellenistic tradition doesn't, say Schmidt doesn't. That way you'll be giving more credit to Schmidt, right? Like he's often ignored. Like just say Schmidt doesn't, and then we can talk about his philosophy. Or say Valens doesn't, if that's the text you have in view. Then provide the citation, provide the argument for interpreting the citation as you do, and then your argument for why this claim is true, right? Or useful. So then you're having a very detailed conversation that's leading to further development, right? Okay, so that's clearing the ground. Hopefully now I've disarmed a few kind of prejudices that might be there going in, and we can look at this text with an open mind.